So I'm Zoë Leadley-Meade. I work at London South Bank University, and just a little bit of a plug, we have a research group, Education for Social Justice, on Twitter at edu4sj. So yeah, if you want to give us a follow, the research group welcomes lots of members, as many as we can get basically. But I probably shouldn't have done that at the start, just in case you don't know what I'm going to say, but yeah. So I'm going to be talking about a bit of my journey. So I'm using methods, if we like methods, autoethnography, it can fall under that. Essentially it's me telling my own personal narrative, so acknowledging that has bias, that it's my experience, I'm not trying to speak for other people or groups of people, etc. I'm also kind of sharing something quite personal, and it's about inviting you into hearing about that experience as well. I guess overall with the aim that hopefully as I reflect on my own learning or unlearning that I'm going to talk about, it may help you to reflect on your own narratives and experiences as well. And with the ultimate goal of everything that we're doing here today, to try and create some sort of a change. I'm going to start with my introduction in terms of who I'm not. Was already said by Silhouette this morning, I don't see myself as an expert, certainly not on theories of race. I've just completed my second year of my professional doctorate, so I'm just about to go into the research phase in the upcoming year. So it's, in terms of theories of race, is quite a new journey for me, really. Might sound obvious, but I'm white, so I'm not someone who has faced racism or oppression because of the colour of my skin. But that does also mean that I'm not immune or free from unconscious bias or racism in my own thinking and behaviour, as has been said today, kind of along those lines that we exist in a racist society. Therefore, we contribute to that in some way, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Who I am, I'd like to think of myself as an experienced educator. I began my career teaching in secondary schools as a secondary English, but majority by the end media studies teacher. Most of my career spent teaching in South London. It's where I've grown up myself as well. I've been in HE coming up for my 5th year, I think now. I work in the education division and I'm a member of the education research group as well. So although I acknowledge the bias that I have tried to be committed to addressing social inequality and racism as part of that. Some of the motivations behind that is that I would consider myself as being witness to systematic oppression and discrimination. Today is quite personally important to me because I grew up in Eltham, literally 5 minutes from where Stephen Lawrence was killed, and growing up during the time of that murder and during the time of the Macpherson report and everything that was happening in our community, kind of battle lines were drawn, BNP knocking at the door, NF sprayed everywhere. It's undoubtedly had an impact and kind of led me to being here today in many ways. I'm also committed to trying to develop my consciousness and my positionality and privilege as white, which is part of why I've done this at the start and why it's part of my reflections as I continue. I'm going to whiz through this a little bit. So I'm going to talk about a moment that happened at the start of my doctoral study. So it kind of began about 2 years ago, and it kind of continued the narrative slightly into my second year, but it's about sort of looking back on this because already I feel that other challenges have faced me and my thinking has moved on since then as well. So it began in my first ED session, and we were asked to read some Paulo Freire and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. It was something that had been shown to me during my master's study. I'd read it and was like, oh, I feel really aligned to his way of thinking, and it felt really radical and different, and it was something that I'd kind of picked up and said that, this is what I try to do in my teaching, and those around me were kind of saying that. But during the session we had some nursing educators, and their response to his writing was that they found it patronising, the idea that you could empower students as if they needed empowering, or it's something that you could do for them. And initially I was like, no, you haven't read it, but this is something that I love and the people I know love, like what's happening here. And my initial response was to try and sort of defend it, and then I was like, but why do I feel that need, and why am I so challenged by what they think? And I just tried to kind of sit with that and explore that further, and started coming across lots of other people that actually critiqued Frere's writing, and particularly 2 other white women who critiqued its application and their use of it and the limitations of it, particularly when educating students, non-white students or students that had different cultural experiences to them, and that they felt it just didn't quite translate in the way that they'd been told it was supposed to. And then I suddenly looked at my reading in terms of my own learning of education, and realised, as a lot of people have said, there was mostly white dead guys on the list. For me, that was particularly sort of revelationary, because in all other aspects of my life I've actively sought out a variety and diversity of voices. In terms of I did a literature degree, so the literature I read, I actively seek out voices of others or people that experience oppression. In the films, I was a media studies teacher who'd actively talk about that. There was something about when I was learning about education that I hadn't even realised how whitewashed it was. So I thought I need to do something about this. This doesn't match up with my kind of learning in other areas of my life. So I started, I'm a massive bookworm, getting as many books as I could. This is becoming a very expensive habit at the moment. My partner's like, another book delivery. So I tried to find as many books as I could to start to engage with different perspectives on education and education theory, with the aim and coming across Spivak, mostly cited in other people at the moment. I haven't quite grappled with her in the raw form. I've slightly attempted, but the idea of the and untraining of our imaginations, and that kind of, it was a moment of me realising how much my understanding of being a teacher was trained. And although I've had some really good mentors, but I hadn't experienced this kind of explicit challenge of racism through teaching. It was all, we need to be inclusive, it needs to include diversity. But the fact that nobody, and not dismissing my own responsibility, but nobody had put bell hooks in front of me throughout my masters, my PGCE, that was at Goldsmiths in South London. Kind of surprised me at the time, so I've been trying to catch up since then, which is, a mountain to climb. So many of these women have been noted already: Audre Lorde, bell hooks, and Heidi Safia Mirza talking about black feminism, but she talked specifically about British black feminism. I'm not going to try and explain their writing. It doesn't need explaining. I think reading it and understanding it for yourself is best. But just from my own reflections, I really felt a call to action by Audre Lorde and bell hooks, and particularly as a white woman, in kind of accepting my responsibility and role in challenging the oppression of people of colour and Indigenous people. And I was somewhat familiar with them kind of through social media, activists, etc., those phrases that get thrown out there. But I realised that a lot of those voices were American, and not that they don't have relevance in the UK, but I hadn't heard of as many black feminist authors and voices, so I was particularly trying to search those out to understand the sort of perspective from a black British perspective also. I then came across critical race theory, or CRT. I found this really useful. I found it quite structured, so I like structure a lot of the time, and then I don't other times. So at the time when I came across it, and I was trying to grapple with the language of race in a more academic context, I guess, it felt like, oh, this is a framework that I can use, and it started to feel like, okay, there's some terminology, and now I can know how to talk about this in an academic kind of a way. And understanding kind of where that comes from, and it is very useful. But I would say more recently I've sometimes felt limited by critical race theory. I felt that structure sometimes hasn't quite always covered everything that I wanted to think about or challenge in my own pedagogy. So with everything that I talk about, I'm trying to be more critical than I was of Freire, and I see the benefits but also some of the limitations. In terms of reading from Indigenous and decolonial theories, I know I've just squeezed these things together, it's a short presentation and there's a lot more that could be said. I came across decolonisation mainly through sort of social media and the things around why is my curriculum so white, and the student-led kind of protests, and then found out about the Roads Must Fall. And so I came across it from that perspective and saw a lot of the backlash against that as well, and then started to look at some of the theory underpinning it. And I felt, particularly having taught in a British secondary school, and educators were always saying that this curriculum does not reflect our current society, especially in English literature. I felt that decolonial theories challenged why our curriculum is so limited in the way that it is, and provided me with a slightly different perspective than CRT does in terms of understanding that. Someone that's had a large impact on me is Eve Tuck, and I came across her in her first article with Calderon as well. I don't know if anybody knows Eve Tuck, but she talks about the call to move from damage-centred to desire-based frameworks. And when she talks about damage-centred frameworks, she talks about the way in which particularly social sciences and in research, and I've definitely been guilty of doing this in my teaching and previously, is that we use the pain of people to justify the challenge that we need to make to the systems, but often that pain is not taken away from those people. The oppression is not taken away, and often we actually create a kind of an advert for the oppressive systems because we're demonstrating how well it works. What she asks is that instead of focusing on sort of excavating this pain and the problems of the world, that we should move more towards desire-based frameworks in the way that we are trying to seek out hope and possibility. And that's definitely impacted on my research, which I'm going to mention towards the end as well. And it's, I've done that with my students. I've gone, here's all of the statistics, and it happens with the BAME attainment gap. Here's all of the statistics about how bad this problem is, and this has been mentioned by many people. We hear this over and over and over again. And as an educator, I want to know, what can I do differently to make things better? So as a teacher, I try to model best practice or the best way to do an assignment, etc. And I was kind of like, where's my model to do these things? We know that we're not doing it right. We know that the education system is failing whole groups of students, but particularly students of colour, Indigenous students in the US, in terms of travellers in the UK as well. So I need to try and find a way, and it helps me to have examples of ways to do that differently in the future. So that was a year and a bit, very quickly condensed. But I guess after that, sort of the beginning of the exploration into the different perspectives and theories that were out there, it was, a term that still comes from kind of Freire and people like that, was a way of, in a way, raising my consciousness that, these things existed. I wish that I'd known before that they'd existed. I wish that I'd sought them out before, but now that I do, it's something that I try to share with others, and I'm continuing. It's the very start of the journey of exploring these different perspectives and thinking about how I can use them within my own practice. Frameworks and language, people have spoken already today about how talking about race and racism can be challenging, and sometimes having the language can help us to do that. But I feel in this country sometimes people learn the language but they don't change their attitudes or their ways of thinking. So I don't think language alone is going to be enough. I think it was me seeing that critical reflexivity and really trying to, although we're always going to have blind spots, challenge our thinking, challenging our knowledge. Where does it come from? Have we got the full picture? You know, what are we using this for? How are we using it? Are we cutting bits and pieces out of it? And what are the problems with that? Also, engaging in these theories, it has supported me in starting to develop, or continuing to develop, my awareness of my positionality as a white educator and researcher. I don't see that as an endpoint. I think it's ongoing, kind of where do I fit in this discussion, in this debate? Where can I have an impact? Where can I provide solidarity? When do I step back and not speak and allow others to take the floor, etc.? So I've completed that first year. Hopefully once I submit my Res 2, my ethics, etc., we'll be moving on to the research side. So it's kind of, this is where I'm at the moment. So I'm moving towards a desire-based framework. I'm trying to focus on people that are doing this work already. Coming to conferences like this are really helpful for that. Looking at how do they experience an unlearning or relearning as we move towards anti-racist pedagogies. So if anybody's here and you may at some point like to participate in this research later on in the academic year, I'll hopefully be at the point of getting in touch with possible participants. But I want to use narrative inquiry as a way to kind of explore people's unlearning, relearning journeys, and I'm very clear in the fact that I don't want to limit it to HE or to formal or informal. I think, Silhouette, did you say non-formal? That term, I was like writing that term down. I feel since I moved to HE, there's a real divide between different types of education and educators, and I think we can all learn from each other. And also in terms of where people's unlearning or relearning is at, it's not about you have to hit a criteria, you have to be this far along in a journey. It's more about just kind of reflecting on that journey as you're going on it. So I would hope that I'd have people at a range of different points in their journey that are kind of reflecting on that as well. And the question that I ask myself constantly is kind of, is this work useful? So part of being here today, as much as it feels quite, I can feel quite vulnerable being here, putting this stuff out here, the aim is because I don't want to do work that just sits on a shelf. I want it to be useful in the real world. I really value people's feedback, challenging what I'm doing if you think it's way off course, or if you don't need to write my research for me, but any kind of feedback I'd really appreciate today as well. That's me done. Is that all right for time?
Yes, we're maybe 5 minutes, about 30 seconds ago.
Okay.
So, yeah, brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Can we thank Zoë?